This year's lecture is on the topic of Banff and the Legacies of Slavery, and I'm honoured and delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. David Alston, to Banff tonight. Dr. Alston is a historian of great repute, with several publications under his belt. He lives in Cromarty and, according to my research, is the founder and curator of Cromarty Courthouse Museum, which many of you may have visited. One of his latest publications is Slaves and Highlanders, Silent Histories of Scotland and the Caribbean, which won the Saltire Society Scottish Book of the Year 2022. His talk tonight will explore the connections between Banffshire and the forced labour of the cotton, coffee and sugar plantations. So welcome to Banff, David, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very fond of Banff. I live in Cromarty. I was saying over dinner earlier, I think Cromarty's ambition over the centuries was to be a bit more like Banff, to be a bit bigger, with more and have more trade. And it has other things in common in that the Urquharts of Craigston also owned the Cromarty estate in the mid-1700s. It also has in common a significant entanglement with Scotland's involvement with slavery and the slave plantations of the Caribbean and South America, and the legacies which are still with us and with the Caribbean as a result of that. But Banff, like Inverness, has a very significant legacy of British colonial slavery in its old school buildings. I think Banff's old academy, Wilson's institution, erected with money made in the slave-driven economy of Grenada, is by far the grander building. Inverness's Royal Academy of the 1790s is now rather lost beside the railway station, while Wilson's Academy still stands prominent on Institution Terrace. The building of 1837, as I'm sure you know, was designed by William Robertson of Elgin, and it combined the school with the Museum of Banff, well, the Banff Institution for Science, Literature and the Arts, founded in 1828. The museum room in the building was designed to be the height of the building, lit from the roof, with a gallery running around at the first floor level. And connecting with it was the schoolroom where public lectures were held, like this. And they explained in a newspaper article later on that the object was to afford the lecturer the use of any specimen which the museum might contain fitted to illustrate his subject. Well, I haven't called on anything from
No skulls.
No skull. There's a very interesting description of the museum collection in newspaper 1849, and you can see from this that the museum was a mirror of empire and beyond. There were stuffed birds from South America, beetles and butterflies from what was generally referred to as the East, tiger heads from Bengal, a polar bear, a boa constrictor, a platypus from Australia, a collection of shells from Java, agricultural implements from India, Hindu idols from Burma, and a model of a Moluccan vessel with 14 oarsmen made entirely from cloves. These all reflected the involvement of Banff men, and it was mostly men, in the British Empire. The collection passed to the Town Council, I think, in 1875, and the current building was opened in 1902. So the museum, which the Society now runs in partnership with Aberdeen Museums Service, has a continuity with that Banff institution of 1828. And so you are like so many other long-established organisations, entangled with the history of empire, colonialism and slavery. So how should we respond to this history today? I'll return to the Academy later on, but I want to begin by exploring some other routes into understanding Banff and the legacies of slavery. In 1898, the Elgin Courant published a series of 22 weekly articles based on what they called the Rose Letters. These were, I quote, letters left in the repositories of Mr. William Rose of Montcoffer and his son, Mr. Patrick Rose, Sheriff Clerk of Elgin and Banff. They were described as interesting and valuable, as illustrating the state of society in these northern parts from a century to a century and a half ago. These papers are now lodged in the University of Aberdeen's special collections as part of a larger set of papers called the Taylor Genealogical Collection. It consisted of papers of the Duff family of Duff House and William Rose at Montcoffer, who was their factor. And the catalogue of the papers confirms the same thing, that the contents will be of interest to local family historians, but the research value is much wider, covering the spheres of local history, estate management, rural affairs, politics, etc. But they're also, I suggest, an important and at least partly unexplored source for understanding Banff's entanglement with slavery and the plantations of the Caribbean, especially Jamaica and Guyana. Now, can I just, when I began my research 25 years ago, I couldn't have told you where Guyana was. It's on the north coast of South America. And it's made up of basically two places, one called Demerara, which you will have heard of, either because of the sugar or the rum, depending on your interests. And next door to it is a colony called Berbice, which very few people have heard of today. In fact, if you try to type it into lots of word processing programs, it will try to correct it automatically. So it's still not very well known, but if you've been here 200 years ago, you would have certainly known about Berbice. The papers were gifted to Aberdeen University by Henrietta Taylor, a granddaughter of Lady Jane Fife, and with her brother Alistair, she published 3 books about the families. The Book of the Duffs, Lord Fife and his Factor, and the Domestic Papers of the Rose family, using material from that collection and from other papers made available to her. Now, the last book, The Domestic Papers of the Rose family, does contain some material on the Rose's time in Guyana, but the articles in the Erskine Courant make it apparent that there's much more in that archive. So, for examples, from the newspaper articles, we learn that in 1766, Lord Fife wrote to William Rose, his factor, about clothing for his household servants. And in the course of that, he referred to a cap I made for the black boy, which would now be available for a new servant to be employed as a running footman. So, there was a black servant in the household of Lord Fife, either in London or at Duff House, but the black boy certainly seems to be known to William Rose, so I suspect he was in Banff. So there's a bit of the history of Duff House that I think emerges from that. In 1802, Andrew Rose, the son of William Rose, wrote from Demerara in Guyana to his father at Montcoffer, saying, "There is a Banff sloop on our river, the Demerara River. The captain died as soon, poor fellow, almost as his arrival." So I think it's surprising, it was certainly surprising to me, that there would be a Banff ship in Guyana on the north coast of South America. Probably not trading directly from Banff to Demerara, but trading from somewhere on the east coast. So again, I think there's a significant bit of information there about Banff's trade around about 1800. And we also learned from these papers about the Grange estate in Jamaica, which was owned by James Duff, like he was later General James Duff. He was an illegitimate son of Lord Fife. And somebody from Banff called, I think he probably is from Banff, called Francis Fordyce, arrived at Grange in 1789. And he wrote, "Grange estate is reckoned a very good one. Last year it made and shipped 120 hogshead of sugar and 50 puncheons of rum. The only deficiency is want of strength, having only 205 negroes, which is thought too few for the size of the plantation." So 205 enslaved people is too few. And he says, "To manage and govern all these slaves, there are only 4 white people, the overseer, carpenter, myself, and another bookkeeper." He goes on to make some interesting comments just about how he perceives it. "Few acquire fortunes here now," he says, "even those that are supported by friends. A person in the planting line never expects to make money here sooner than 20 years. A beginning in this country is everything. You need connections, friends. And often, before you can obtain that, toil, disappointment, and sickness close the career of life and put a period to a wearied out existence. So lots of people die. It takes them a long time to make money, but they still go. It's the lure of the possibility of these fortunes that could be made, in this case in sugar and rum. And from elsewhere in the papers, there are letters written by Hugh Hayrose, who was William Rose's seventh son. He was a soldier in the Portuguese army, and he settled in Jamaica at a plantation called Harmony Hill. So that's just a sample of what I think is still to be discovered from these papers. And because of lockdown, I'd hoped that over the last couple of years I might be able to get to Aberdeen to look at them. I haven't been able to, so I'm relying on these articles from 1898. It's interesting that although the Taylors, Henrietta and her brother, did describe something of Andrew Rose's time in Demerara, the word slave or slavery occurs only twice in the book. And that's solely in connection with debates in Parliament about abolition and about the need to oppose abolition. What interests me here is how a change in focus can suddenly shed light on what was there all along, if only we had our eyes open and our ears open to hear. And I also noticed it was the anonymous writer in the Elgin Courant who saw something of the wider significance of this material. And I do actually wonder if it could possibly be a younger Henrietta Taylor, not constrained by the demands of family history that allowed her to take that wider view. There's another shift in focus that's needed in this history, from the enslavers to the enslaved. And this lecture is going to fail in making that shift on any significant scale. But let me at least begin with a mention of an enslaved man born on the island of Carrickoo, which is just north of Grenada, part of the colony, on plantation Craigston, and given the slave name Banff. He became a labourer, what was often called a field slave, and because he was flat-footed, each day must have been an even greater struggle on the plantation. When he was about 25, he was sold to a plantation called Belvedere in the island of St. Vincent, as part of a group of 12 enslaved males and 6 enslaved females. Did Banff have a wife and children among that group? I don't know. Craigston was a cotton plantation. Belvedere was a sugar plantation. The regime on a sugar plantation was much harsher. On Carrickoo, the slaveholder had been William Urquhart of Craigston. On St. Vincent, it was a Glasgow-born woman called Elizabeth Stewart, now Mrs. Haggart. In 1834, she received government compensation on the emancipation of slaves of £5,310, which is about £570,000 in today's purchasing power, for the emancipation of 183 enslaved people on Belvedere. I don't know if Banff was among them, if he'd lived that long or not. That's something which is discoverable through the slave registers which are held at the UK National Archives in Kew. So it is possible to begin to recover something of the lives of individuals. Banff is an example, but Banff is one among millions. As I said, the Taylors did give some account of Andrew Rose's time in Demerara, so let me start with the origins of the Roses family's interest in Demerara. The Rose letters also reveal that in 1774, William Rose at Montcoffer, married the previous year, received a letter from his cousin, Thomas Cumming, in Demerara. Demerara was then a Dutch colony. It remained in the control of the Dutch until 1796, when Britain took over. They were both 34 years old. Thomas had been married for 6 years. He'd already told William in an earlier record that he'd reason to be thankful for my choice of wife, with whom I enjoy a large share of conjugal felicity. Men writing to each other. He now had further cause to be grateful. He said, I think to be able to bring £20,000 sterling towards a purchase in North Britain, his purchase of a property, which I would willingly content myself with, notwithstanding that by staying a few years longer here, I might increase my fortune considerably. Purchasing power of £20,000 in 1774 is about £3.7 million. So he's a 34-year-old who thinks he can bring well over £3 million to a purchase in the north. It's even more remarkable by the fact when you consider that his father had died in prison. He was taken prisoner after Culloden and died in prison. And the family, the mother had to bring up the children as a Jacobite family, and all the difficulties that will. I'll come back to coming in a moment. What I'd like now to do is to read a section from my book about the Cummings. Now, the Cummings are from Murray, but they're closely related to the Roses. What I want to do with this is to try and get you in imagination to enter into something of the complex world that people like Thomas Cumming and the Roses are inhabiting. So, imagine. On Sunday, 3rd November 1799, in the parish of Urshart near Elgin, the Cumming family gathered for a double christening of 60-year-old Thomas Cumming's daughter, Hannah, and his grandson, Christopher. Babies born within 2 weeks of each other. In 1798, Thomas had returned from Demerara, where he was the owner of 2 sugar plantations and 600 enslaved Africans. He bought Innis House, near Elgin, styled himself Thomas Cumming of Leuchars, had his portrait painted and married for the second time. His young wife, Isabella Fraser, had been seriously ill since the baby Hannah's birth, and she was confined to bed. And Isabella's 3 brothers, James, Simon and Evan Fraser of Belladrum, were all absent in South America, where they were prominent planters in Demerara and Berbice. But Isabella's sister, Sarah, had joined them with her husband, William Fraser of Kilbokie, recently returned from St. Vincent. Cumming's older daughter, Catherine, that's the baby Christopher's mother, had been born in Demerara in 1769 to his first wife, a Dutch widow. With her, with the daughter, was the baby's father, John Bagot, an Anglo-Irish officer in the British Army, accompanied by his sister and brother. Then there were Thomas Cumming's 5 unmarried sisters from Dufftown, still supporters of the long-lost Jacobite cause, including the youngest, Eliza, dressed in her habitual black as a sign of mourning for the Stuarts' loss of the throne. It was not until 20 years later that she put on her brightest colours on hearing news of the death of George III. They were joined by a nephew, the son of Thomas's older brother, William Cumming, by now known as Guillaume. He had fled Scotland for France after the defeat of the Jacobite army at Culloden, and had risen to become a Chevalier of the Order of St. Louis, and aide-de-camp to Prince Francois Xavier of Saxony. Guillaume may have died by this time, but his son, the French-speaking nephew, was there. He was Thomas de Cumming, de Craigmilne, and had been educated from 1786 at the École Militaire in Brienne, where his older brother, André, had also been a pupil. Thomas de Cumming had recently arrived from Amsterdam, and this was perhaps the first time they had all met. No doubt everyone was interested in his brother André's former classmate at the École Militaire, a young Corsican named Bonaparte. Collectively, this extended family spoke English, French, Dutch, and probably Gaelic. They mourned the defeat of the Stuarts and loyally served the Hanoverian state. And they were citizens of nations and empires who were at that moment at war with each other. Yet they were one family whose interests crossed all these boundaries. Demerara, which was above all a place to make money, engendered such entanglements. However, Thomas's wife, who had been confined to bed, died. He decided that he couldn't manage his estates in Demerara at a distance and decided to return, leaving his infant daughter to be brought up by relations. He travelled to Demerara later in 1800 with that nephew, the French-speaking nephew, Thomas de Cumming. And in November of that year, he was joined by William Rose's sixth son, 17-year-old Andrew Rose. When Andrew stepped off the ship, he met Thomas Cumming and Thomas's cousin Lachlan Cumming at a sale of Negroes. It's a public vendue or slave auction. In that year, 1800, 26 slave ships landed in Demerara, 8,000 enslaved Africans. With 8,000 enslaved Africans, about another 1,000 would have died on the voyage. Andrew would soon become a slaveholder himself. He'd been educated in Banff, and briefly in Edinburgh, and he then worked in a counting house in Glasgow, learning what was in the modern science of accounting. And in June 1799, he found someone who could train him as a land surveyor. I wonder if this was on the advice of Thomas Cumming. It was certainly an astute decision, given the development of new coastal plantations in Demerara and neighbouring Berbice, land reclaimed from the sea and the mudflats, and colossal works of civil engineering, all carried out by the labour of enslaved Africans, and all needing to be surveyed to establish boundaries. He soon found himself employment, and in April 1801 he'd set up business on his own account. In 1805 he was doing so well that he suggested his sister Anna could marry well in the colony, sent him £100 to cover her expenses. And in 1806 she married the Dutchman Philip Teeney, who, although the colony was controlled by Britain at the moment, has stayed on in his post as translator and also as secretary to the governments in Demerara. After the birth of their first child, Anna and Philip, Anna wrote to her mother in Banff and said, "I told you in my last letter that Andrew had lost his little Mary. On the whole, it is a fortunate circumstance, as it is next to impossible to bring up a girl of that colour virtuously." What she meant was that little Mary's mother was black, and it was better that the child was dead. 4 years later, Andrew manumitted, that's freed, an enslaved woman named Minky and her mulatto child, Anna. This was Andrew's child, and later there was a son, George. Minky was probably also the mother of the young girl, Mary. In 1815, a notice was placed in the Demerara newspaper informing the public of the sale of the lot number 229, Cummingsburg, with the buildings thereon, to the free Minky Rose, with remainder to her children, Anne and George Rose. This was a house in the new part of Georgetown, the capital of Demerara, which had been laid out and named after Thomas Cumming. It's worth noting that when Andrew first put it on the market in 1811, he had also offered for sale 20 to 35 very valuable Negroes, men, women and children, and likewise a very easy ambling pony. The house, men, women and children, and the pony were all chattel or property. So in 1811, there was Anna Rose in Demerara, a young girl of mixed race, whose sister's death had been a fortunate circumstance, and Anne Rose married into the Teeney family, and they're back in Britain, probably in Glasgow. Through connections made through his in-laws in Glasgow, Philip Teeney entered into a business partnership in 1812 with Samuel Sandbach of the merchant house McEnroe Parker and Company, forming Sandbach Teeney and Company, based in Liverpool. At emancipation in 1834, the British government paid £20 million in compensation, not to formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants, but to slaveholders, as compensation for their loss of property. Sandbach Teeney and Co. received £173,577, the equivalent of about 12.9 million in purchasing power today. It was the second largest compensation payment made to a merchant house in Britain. The disparity in wealth notwithstanding, though, both Anna Rose and Anne Rose and their descendants are equally part of Banff's human legacies of slavery. I'd like to go back to the academy now. James Wilson, who left the money to fund the academy, had died in 1799, a week after he arrived in London from Grenada, leaving his property to trustees who were to pay the interest, the life interest, to his sister, his wife, and his illegitimate son in Grenada, James Wilson Jr. Only when all three had died were the funds to come to the magistrates of Banff to be used for charitable purposes. And it was only after the death of his sister in London in the 1830s that they received the funds and the new school was built. Foundation stone laid in 1836 in a grand civic celebration. Now, unfortunately, the Academy, unlike some other schools, do not publish annual prize lists, and there are no surviving admission registers, that I know of. In Inverness, in 1804, in their academy, there were 25 pupils from the Caribbean, almost a tenth of the school roll. Banff Academy almost certainly had a similar role in the education of children born to Banthmen in the colonies in the Caribbean. In both 1841 and 1851, a group of 5 young people, a brother, sister, and 3 cousins, all with the surname Cruikshank, lived in Prospect Cottage on Gallow Hill. We were having a discussion earlier, and the cottage is still there.
Yes.
The house belonged to George Cruikshank, a farmer in Ford, who died in 1841. His brother was Dr. Cruikshank, and in February 1853, a death notice appeared in Scottish and Liverpool newspapers, which announced the death in Nikerrie, colony of Suriname, that's Dutch Guyana, just further along the coast of South America, on 10th December last, 1852. William Stewart Cruikshank, son of the late Dr. Cruikshank, MD, Hawks of course, in Ford. This is the 8th son of the same family who has died in different parts of the West Indies. 8 sons in several colonies, not all of them British, including Grenada, Tobago, Demerara, and Suriname. The inhabitants of Prospect Cottage at this time were some of the grandchildren. The oldest was 20, and she was the head of the household. She was still described as a scholar. So most of them are scholars attending school in Banff. 3 of them in 1841, Emma Jane, Robert and Harriet, were the children of John Cruikshank, who was a planter in Tobago, along with his brothers William and Cosmo. His plantation, like the cottage, was called Prospect. I don't think that's a coincidence. Emma Jane was not there in 1851 because in 1845, at the age of 15, she'd married 42-year-old Kay Dowland, a stipendiary magistrate in Tobago. There's a picture survives of her as a young girl. I'm not sure where it was painted, but it looks like right at the time she wasn't there. Mr. Dowland and his young wife Emma lived in Tobago in a period after the end of British colonial slavery. Dowland's reports as a stipendiary magistrate gave an insight into the life on the island as former slaves created new lives for themselves. Most wanted to be independent farmers, run small businesses, or practice a trade as a carpenter, mason, or blacksmith. Planters wanted to continue sugar production and required a labour force. In Tobago, what developed was a system of sharecropping, known as métayage, which allowed planters to retain labour. The métayers occupied land, cultivated it, and then shared the crop with the proprietor. And that system shaped society in Tobago during the rest of the 19th century. It was first introduced in the island by John Cruikshank on the Prospect estate, and then spread throughout the island. And Prospect was also noted for the large number of plots that it sold to labourers. So another legacy of slavery in Banff, really sort of post-slavery in the whole social structure of a whole island in the Caribbean. James Wilson, who left the money, had been a merchant in St George in Grenada, and among the elite of the island's population. In 1787 he was part of the troop, that's the cavalry of the island's militia, whose membership was drawn from the gentleman who could afford to keep a suitable horse. He survived, or was absent from Grenada during one of the major uprisings of enslaved people in the Caribbean in the 18th century, the Fedon Revolution of 1795. Although Wilson died in 1799, I think that his son, James Wilson Jr., remained active in Grenada. To be precise, on the island of Carriacou, to the north of Grenada. He was the attorney, that's what Scotland would call a factor. The attorney for 40 states and accountable for 426 enslaved people. Carriacou was, in terms of its white population, a particularly Scottish island. In 1790, a quarter of its free population were Scottish, a quarter English, a third French, and the remainder, about a fifth, were people of colour. Most of the Scots were from an area around Banff, Keith, Huntly and Turriff. And there were plantations named Craigston, as already mentioned, where Banff was born in slavery, and Meldrum, both owned by the Urquhart family. Carriacou has a carnival tradition unique to the island called the Shakespeare Mass. Mass is short for masque, masquerade. And on Shrove Tuesday every year, masked and costumed men go from village to village to engage in verbal and in the past physical combat. The Shakespeare Mass is created through a combination of African stick fighting traditions and competitive and aggressive recitation of speeches from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. The play was certainly made familiar in British colonial schools later through a textbook called The Royal Reader. And the same speeches would have been familiar to pupils in Banff Academy. In Carriacou and the rest of the Caribbean, what matters is not what the former slaves and their descendants were taught about the text, but how the text spoke to them and how they then spoke through the text. It's said that on Shrove Tuesday, during the time of slavery, there was a license to say anything to white enslavers with impunity and with no fear of punishment. Now, I don't know if that's true. The Banff have that opportunity. I don't know. But I can imagine the emotional release of being able to declaim, I was born free as Caesar, so were you. Or, therein ye gods, you tyrants do defeat. Nor stony wall, nor walls of beaten brass, nor airless dungeon, nor strong links of iron can be retentive to the strength of spirit. And these last lines could be a description of a slave ship. Or even the apocalyptic vision of a common slave, you know him well by sight, held up his left hand, which did flame and burn, like 20 torches joined, and yet his hand, not sensible of fire, remained unscorched. The Shakespeare Mass is one of the ways in which the descendants of enslaved Africans in Carriacou still respond to this history. So how are we in Scotland today to approach the history which we share with them? What are we to do with it? Well, above all, I think we have to acknowledge and engage with this history, with all its difficulties for us. We have to talk with the descendants of enslaved Africans about reparation, about how we repair the damaging legacies of slavery, which persist throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere. The difficulty for us is often the emotional engagement which this requires. And as an inspiration, I offer you the thoughts of the Guyanese writer and archivist Jan Carew, who died in his 90s a few years ago. It's how I end my book, so this is a full reading. In the book I talked about the about plantation in Cromarty on the coast of Berbice. Near to plantation Cromarty on the Quarantine coast of Berbice was plantation Kiltern. It was created by George Rainey, who would later clear the island of Rassay of its people, along with his younger brother Gilbert and their cousin Gilbert Robertson, the son of the parish minister of Kiltern on the Cromarty Firth. The leading Caribbean writer and political thinker Jan Carew, who died in 2012 at the age of 92, was a descendant of both slaves and slave owners at Kiltern, and Carew's mother was a Robertson. He remembered that his great-grandmother had said this: "There are ghosts in our blood, and we're lucky, because the lowliest, the ones who suffer most in the world of the living, are always top dogs in the spirit world. We are blessed with the blood of the most persecuted folks on earth: Africans, Caribs, Portuguese Jews, French convicts from Devil's Island, Highland Scots." A very generous comment. And the Lord alone knows what else. That generous comment on Highland Scots, people like the Robertsons and the Raineys who had come to Guyana to exploit islands. His great-grandmother's magnanimity and profound influence on Carew, who used her words in his conversations with Malcolm X to summarise his own political creed, arguing for tolerance. Whenever we cut ourselves, this is his great-grandmother again, whenever we cut ourselves, we can see ghosts of those others peeping out from the African and Amerindian blood. The ghosts are always there, talking their conflicting talk, until there's a Tower of Babel inside your head. So, you've got to listen well and search out the kindest, the strongest, the most human of these voices, and make them your own.